Hey everyone, tonight we're kicking things off with the absolute unit known as Homo neanderthalensis, our brawny, brainy and often misunderstood cousins who didn't just survive the Ice Age, they practically bench-pressed it. From their insane strength to their unexpectedly rich culture, Neanderthals weren't just cavemen, they were nature's gym buffs with a knack for interior design. If you'd stepped into Ice Age Europe about 80,000 years ago, you'd probably freeze solid in under 30 seconds. But before that, you might spot a Neanderthal, the dominant local hominin, and quite possibly the only creature on Earth that looked like it could win a wrestling match against a mammoth. Neanderthals weren't just different from us, they were built for hardship. Imagine someone designed by bodybuilders, Arctic engineers, and a person who really valued a massive forehead. That's a Neanderthal. Let's begin with the body. Neanderthals were generally shorter than us, usually about 5'4" to 5'6", but calling them short misses the point. They were compact, dense and muscular. Their rib cages were large, their shoulders broad, and their entire frames looked like they'd been reinforced for demolition duty. Their bones were thick and heavy, built for more than just surviving. They were built for battle. Their limbs were short and powerful, ideal for retaining heat in freezing climates. Their hands were huge, with strong thumbs, excellent for making tools, grabbing prey, or opening jars. Modern humans wouldn't dare attempt. Now, about that face. Neanderthals didn't look strange, we do. Their skulls were long and low, featuring prominent brow ridges that resembled ski ramps. Their noses were big and jutted out, likely to warm cold air before it reached their lungs. Their jaws were powerful, their chins nearly absent, and their expressions probably hovered somewhere between mildly confused and perpetually ready to brawl. But don't mistake them for brainless brutes. They weren't a failed version of us, they were a successful alternative. Everything about them was suited to their world, and they thrived in it. Neanderthals were endurance beasts, surviving conditions that involved blizzards, cave bears, and hunting with little more than a sharpened stick. Their very bodies said, "Yes, I've broken multiple ribs, and no, I have no regrets." If you've ever felt proud for lifting a full milk jug without hurting yourself, sit down. Neanderthals were walking fortresses. Their skeletons didn't just suggest toughness, they screamed it. Modern human femurs look flimsy next to theirs. Their legs were short and ridiculously strong, perfect for navigating rugged, mountainous terrain while carrying half a reindeer over one shoulder. Their knees were built for non-stop bending and squatting, useful when you're always tending fires, shaping tools, or digging into a fresh carcass. Their arms, equally intense. Their upper arm bones were thick, and their forearms even more so, a rarity among our relatives. And it wasn't for show, they weren't posing for Instagram. They were literally made to lift, haul, and survive. If we're Swiss Army knives, Neanderthals were jackhammers with eyebrows. Even their rib cages told a story. Ours taper, theirs flared out. This gave them space for massive lungs, perfect for sucking in oxygen in the thin, frigid air of glacial Europe. Think of their breathing system as industrial bellows. More air in, more fuel for mammoth hunting madness. Their skulls, beyond just the brow ridges, their skulls were long, flat and thick, with huge areas for muscle attachment, meaning powerful jaws and strong necks. They probably could chew frozen meat like it was nothing. But this build came at a cost. They matured faster than we do and likely had shorter lifespans. Still, while they were around, they lived hard. Their bones show signs of constant trauma, healed fractures, joint damage, blunt impacts, like they were extras in an ancient action movie. Now for the big question, were they smart? Neanderthals had big brains. Literally, bigger than ours. Around 1,350 centimeters circubi compared to our average of 1,150 centimeters. These so-called brutish cavemen were walking around with some serious brain power, without the misery of spreadsheets. But a caveat, big doesn't always mean smarter. A blue whale's brain is huge, and it hasn't invented Wi-Fi. Still, Neanderthals weren't just lugging around empty skulls. They carried that massive brain like cranial ballast. A large chunk of it was dedicated to sensory processing and motor control, especially sight and movement, which makes sense when your daily routine includes trailing elk through a blizzard and trying not to fall off a cliff, navigating harsh terrain, tracking animals over long distances, and using tools without GPS or scrollable thumbs required serious coordination. Their visual cortex was especially large, likely granting them razor-sharp eyesight. Imagine frost-covered Neanderthals narrowing their eyes into the snowstorm, like Ice Age anime protagonists, only with more hair and fewer dramatic speeches. And while their prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for planning and self-control, may have been proportionally smaller than ours, that doesn't mean they were impulsive. Their survival depended on foresight, collaboration, and creativity, including things like cave painting, and possibly dabbing ochre on their faces like early makeup. So yes, your Neanderthal great-aunt may have pioneered contouring long before it ever hit TikTok. Neanderthals adapted across vast regions of Europe and Asia, from dry grasslands to frozen tundra, showing an impressive mental flexibility. They figured out how to utilize local materials, build shelters, craft tools, and occasionally invent new ways to injure themselves with sharp rocks. Still unimpressed? Consider this. For a long time we assumed their art and technology were knockoffs of Homo sapiens ideas, until we discovered Neanderthal art and jewelry older than anything early modern humans made in those areas. Turns out, we were the latecomers to the cave soiree. If nature held a Survive Anything design competition, Neanderthals would have taken the prize, and likely used it as a hammer afterward. They weren't just surviving the Ice Age, they were tailored for it. Think of weather so cold your nose hairs freeze. Now imagine facing that without heaters, sweatshirts, or the faintest idea what cocoa was. That was their domain. Their short, stocky builds weren't random, they were precision engineering. This compact frame minimized heat loss, exactly what you'd want when the world resembled a haunted grocery store's freezer aisle. Long limbs lose heat faster. Neanderthals had stubby, thick limbs that would earn penguin approval. Their noses weren't for gossip. They were built to humidify and warm frigid air before it hit the lungs. Nature's HVAC system, in your face. And though their exact skin tone isn't known, most scientists believe they had lighter pigmentation to better absorb vitamin D in low-light environments. When the sun disappears for months, you need to ring light from a grey sky however you can. Their lung capacity was probably enormous, a necessity when your daily grind includes hunting, climbing, carving, hauling, and occasionally inventing new ways to pull a muscle. That wide barrel-like chest wasn't aesthetic, it was a prehistoric forge. And yes, Neanderthals wore clothing, not just random fur slung over one shoulder, unless that was a personal choice. Evidence shows they wore stitched hide garments for insulation, and stitching is no joke. It requires planning, tool-making, and perhaps even a concept of layering. In other words, Neanderthals weren't barely scraping by in the cold, they were dominating it. They weren't evolutionary leftovers, they were snowplows in fur, trudging through the cold with low grunts and bafflement at mammoths' dramatic reactions. When you picture Neanderthal fashion, you might think of a single fur wrap held with a vine, accessorized with a club and zero fashion sense. But real Neanderthal clothing, surprisingly practical. Primitive, yes, but designed with function over flair, and enough rough charm to send a medieval tailor into shock. Ice Age Europe wasn't the place to test minimalist fashion. If you stepped out in winter wearing only good vibes, you'd be an icicle before you could say saber-toothed. So they got innovative. They didn't just toss animal skins over their shoulders, they processed hides, softened them and sewed them with bone needles. Yes, they were handcrafting mammoth and deer outfits before buttons were even a thing, and without online forums to complain on. And then there were the accessories. Sites have revealed eagle talons, pierced shells, and beads. Not practical, which hints at style, meaning, or maybe just some Ice Age swagger. Imagine a Neanderthal striding into camp like, yes, this claw necklace is real. Yes, I caught the bird. No, you can't touch it. They also used ochre, Red pigment on tools, their bodies, maybe even their faces. Was it war paint? Decoration? A social signal? We don't know, but it means at some point, a Neanderthal looked at a red rock and thought, this would look amazing on my cheekbones. Were they fashion show ready? Not unless the runway was snowy, lit by torches, and ended in a reindeer chase. But their clothing worked. It kept them warm, somewhat dry, and shielded from both the cold and reality. Let's not forget the practical genius either. Every piece of clothing they wore was biodegradable, locally sourced, and based on hunting, which technically is a kind of sustainable Ice Age fashion. Neanderthals weren't just strong, they were strong enough to punch a woolly rhino in the face. The kind of strength that makes you wonder if physics worked differently back then, or if they just had a lifetime membership to nature's gym. Every aspect of their body screamed strength. Their muscles were massive, especially in their shoulders, arms, and legs, all areas essential for daily tasks like spear throwing, skinning animals, dragging carcasses, and sometimes just casually shifting boulders. Their bone structure, as already discussed, could support a siege weapon, meaning their muscles weren't just decorative, they were purely functional. But how powerful were they, exactly? Estimates suggest that a male Neanderthal might have been up to 50% stronger than a modern man of the same size, and when it comes to upper body power, maybe even twice as strong. This wasn't your average farm strong or dad strength. This was the kind of strength where you might accidentally rip a cave door off its hinges. They didn't rely solely on throwing projectiles from a distance. No, Neanderthals preferred close combat. They'd approach enormous, angry Ice Age megafauna and jab them with spears from just a few feet away. Their idea of prepping dinner meant dodging tusks while clutching onto something actively trying to kill them. And the damage? It's all recorded in their fossils. Healed fractures, crushed ribs, skull injuries, all signs that they weren't just muscular, but incredibly tough. When something broke, they either kept going or patched it up with moss and carried on hunting. Even their grip was extraordinary. Some scientists believe they could crush a modern human's hand with little effort. Their thumbs were thick, their fingers wide, and their knuckles capable of inflicting medieval-level damage. Picture the Rock, but hairier and with a stone axe. You're not too far off. If Neanderthal fossils say anything consistently, it's that these people lived hard lives. Not Mr. Sunscreen reapplication hard, but fought a rampaging bison before lunch hard. Their bones don't read like peaceful ancient memoirs. They read like accident reports from the Ice Age version of a rodeo. In fact, when researchers studied trauma patterns in Neanderthal remains, they noticed something strange. The injuries resembled those of modern professional rodeo riders. And no, that's not an exaggeration. If your life regularly includes wrestling with one-ton animals, your bones start to tell the same story. Take Shanidar 1, for instance. This individual suffered a head injury that crushed part of his skull, possibly leaving him partially blind. He also had a withered right arm from a healed break and a damaged foot. Basically, he was the prehistoric poster boy for orthopedic treatment. Yet he lived for years afterward. That means other Neanderthals must have cared for him, showing that even if you were a battered warrior with limited mobility, your group still saved you a seat by the fire. Another case, La Chapelle aux Saints, involved an older male with severe arthritis, missing teeth and spinal degeneration, and again he was looked after. So Neanderthals weren't just getting hurt in ways that would horrify today's workplace safety experts. They also helped each other recover. They combined survival with compassion. Neanderthals said, "Yes, we do both." The frequency of these injuries tells us something crucial about how they lived. These weren't folks who picked berries or hunted squirrels from a distance. They engaged directly with danger. Their weapons were mostly thrusting spears, meant to stab, not to throw. And when you hunt that way, the prey doesn't go down without a fight. Next time you trip over a rug and feel sorry for yourself, remember that Neanderthals got tackled by prehistoric killing machines, patched themselves up with moss, and still managed to live long enough to invent personal hygiene. That's true resilience. Neanderthals didn't just survive the Ice Age, They brought fire to it. And that's the Stone Age equivalent of telling winter, "Not today, Satan." They weren't shooting fireballs or making s'mores, but they definitely understood how to create, maintain, and use fire in ways that would have impressed a prehistoric Bear Grylls. How do we know? Archaeological digs have uncovered clear signs of hearths, central fire pits with scorched bones, heat-altered stones, and layers of ash built up over years in the same place. That's not a random lightning strike. That's a Neanderthal picking a fire spot, setting it up, and cooking dinner beside it, probably while glaring at the snow. The leading theory is that they used techniques like striking flint against pyrite to create sparks, which could then light dry grass or moss. No matches, no lighters, no online tutorials, just grit, clever hands, and a suspiciously well-chosen rock pile. The Ice Age version of Watch This. But fire wasn't just for staying warm. It made food easier to chew and digest. That wasn't just a cooking upgrade. It made nutrients more accessible, reduced parasites, and freed up time to develop other useful things, like gossip. And fire also had benefits for tool making. Heating flint made it easier. Shaping or flaking stone became easier with heat. So it's possible Neanderthals were experimenting with thermal techniques long before humans invented unnecessary committees. And fire wasn't just for survival, it was protection too. Fire kept predators at bay. Sitting around a fire meant warmth, light, and a kind of primitive force field against anything lurking in the shadows. Imagine a circle of Neanderthals roasting meat, swapping stories, and casting looming silhouettes on cave walls. Fire was their security system. Were they the first to discover fire? Probably not, but they refined its use in their own calm, methodical way. They didn't brag about it, they just quietly transformed freezing caves into homes and raw meat into something slightly more chewable. Neanderthals didn't have toolboxes, screwdrivers, or video tutorials, but hand them a piece of flint and some peace and quiet, and they'd assemble a toolkit capable of skinning a deer, building a shelter, and maybe even uncorking a medieval wine bottle. Their tools weren't just random sharp rocks, they were carefully shaped implements, made with intention, precision, and just enough focused aggression. The main technique they used was the Levallois method, a complex, multi-step approach involving the preparation of a stone core so that flakes could be struck off in a deliberate shape. They weren't just randomly smashing stones together. They planned, shaped, studied the angles, and struck with such expertise that modern archaeologists sometimes mistake their work for early modern human tools, which must be a bit irritating for them. Among their toolset were scrapers, points, awls, borers, and even hafted tools. Blades attached to wooden shafts using tree resin and sinew. That's not just make it sharp, that's prehistoric composite tech. Think duct tape, but much harder to figure out. These tools were used for a range of tasks: cutting meat, tanning hides, woodworking, and likely some expressive hand-waving. And really, anyone who figured out how to glue stone to wood using natural glue and patience deserves a round of applause. Their tool designs even varied by region. That tells us they weren't simply imitating each other, they were adapting, customizing their methods based on local resources, environments, and prey. Some groups favored limestone, others used flint, and a few experimented with antler or bone tools. It was essentially prehistoric Etsy, and they weren't resistant to progress either. Over time, their tools evolved, becoming sharper, more effective, and more dangerous. This wasn't natural selection alone, it was intellect and repetition at work. When most people think of Neanderthals, they picture hunched figures around a fire, clutching a club in one hand and dinner in the other. But archaeology paints a different picture, one where the same people who could take apart a reindeer in minutes also took time to decorate a shell or bury someone with flowers. Yes, Neanderthals had culture, and not the kind that grows on old meat. Let's start with burial. Several Neanderthal sites show signs of purposeful graves, shallow pits, sometimes including objects or pollen, suggesting flowers might have been placed with the deceased. Whether this was spiritual, symbolic, or just a heartfelt they liked plants, we don't know, but it shows they had care and ritual. They didn't just toss the dead behind a rock and call it good. And then there's the art. For a long time, the assumption was that Neanderthals didn't create art. That was supposedly exclusive to us. But then cave paintings in Spain, made with red ochre over 64,000 years ago, were discovered, predating modern humans in Europe. That awkward silence, that's the sound of anthropologists reconsidering a lot. They also collected decorative items, pierced shells, feathers, eagle talons, things that didn't serve any obvious practical use unless they were secretly getting into cosplay. These might have been worn as adornments used in rituals or served as social signals. Whatever the case, they weren't just focused on survival, they cared about meaning. One of the most mysterious finds was deep in a French cave, a circular structure made of broken stalagmites, built around 6,000 years ago. No light, no clear purpose, and no carvings. Just Neanderthals assembling things in the dark. Whether it was ritualistic or just eccentric is anyone's guess. And don't forget about language. They had the hyoid bone, vital for speech, and genetic traits tied to language processing. So while they may not have been writing poems, they definitely weren't just making grunts. Somewhere in the past, one Neanderthal looked at another and said something important. Probably meat-related, but still important. Now let's get to the topic everyone wonders about. Yes, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens did, in fact, mingle, romantically, biblically, genetically. Around 60,000 years ago, when early humans migrated into Europe and Asia, they met the Neanderthals, and instead of keeping their distance, they did the evolutionary equivalent of texting you up with no shame. We know this happened because it's in our DNA, literally. Most non-African populations today carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA, which means that somewhere down the line, one of your many great-grandparents had a rendezvous during the Ice Age that escalated quickly. Was it love? Strategy? A prehistoric, well, the options are limited. Researchers are still discussing it. Some interactions may have been consensual, others perhaps not. It's difficult to know for certain. We can't be entirely certain what romance looked like in prehistoric times, but we do know it left behind genetic traces that still affect things like immunity, skin pigmentation, and possibly even your distaste for cilantro. Interestingly, this wasn't just a one-off occurrence. Genetic data indicates that interbreeding took place multiple times, in various regions, over thousands of years. So clearly, it wasn't just one confused Homo sapiens at a dimly lit cave gathering. And it wasn't always the same pattern. Neanderthal males and Homo sapiens females appear to have paired off more often, perhaps thanks to the charm of travel stories or slightly superior cheekbone structure. We'll never know for sure if Neanderthals were more swayed by witty conversation or by flint-sparked fires. But one thing is clear. This mingling didn't result in some kind of combined superspecies. Neanderthals eventually disappeared, but parts of them remain in us. Your wider-than-average nose could be a Neanderthal legacy. That passion for steak and reluctance to run, also a little suspicious. Before poking fun at Neanderthals for their heavy brows or questionable Ice Age fashion, you might want to take a closer look at your genetic report, because statistically, you may be part Neanderthal. No offense, it's just science. Thanks to genome mapping and dedicated scientists with powerful microscopes and probably too much caffeine, we now know that most people of non-African descent have about 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA, which means if you're watching this and your great-great-great-great-great-grandparent wore animal skins and didn't flinch during a snowstorm, congrats, you've got Ice Age roots. And this ancient genetic heritage isn't just a quirky historical fact. It has real biological impact. Neanderthal DNA has been linked to traits like skin tone, hair type, immune system responses, and even pain sensitivity. So if you burn easily, have odd allergic reactions, or stub your toe and feel like you've been hit by a truck, you may be running on the Neanderthal edition of the human software. Some research even suggests Neanderthal DNA affects sleep patterns, fat processing, and medication responses. It may also influence emotional regulation, meaning your seasonal grumpiness might actually be in your genes. But it's not all benefits. Certain Neanderthal gene variants have been tied to conditions like type 2 diabetes, depression, and even nicotine addiction. So while your Ice Age ancestors may have helped you fend off saber-toothed predators, they might also be partly responsible for your snack cravings and doom-scrolling tendencies. It's also important to note that African populations whose ancestors didn't interbreed with Neanderthals after migrating out of Africa tend to have little or no Neanderthal DNA, but they do carry traces of other ancient human relatives like the Denisovans, which means humanity's family tree isn't a tidy diagram, it's more like a tangled, genetically dramatic shrub. Neanderthals flourished for nearly 300,000 years, enduring Ice Age conditions, saber-toothed threats, and each other. They were the original inhabitants of Europe, the first locals. Then about 40,000 years ago they quietly vanished. No massive disaster, no asteroid, just a gradual disappearance, as if they missed the memo about the Holocene. What happened? One explanation is climate change. As the Ice Age waned, Neanderthals struggled to adapt to shifting habitats. Their hunting zones changed, large prey became harder to find, and even mammoths started acting unpredictable. For a species built for the cold, warming weather wasn't a relief, it was a crisis. Another possibility is competition from Homo sapiens. When modern humans entered Europe, they brought new technologies like long-range weapons, more diverse diets, and an annoying knack for surviving just about anywhere. They reproduced quickly, travelled far, and communicated more, all major advantages in the game of survival. It's also likely that Neanderthals were simply outnumbered. Their populations were smaller and more isolated, which meant lower genetic diversity, a big issue when every winter is a test of endurance and your competitors are multiplying like it's a contest. And yet, this wasn't a violent conquest. There's no overwhelming evidence of war or extermination. If anything, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens coexisted for thousands of years. They exchanged genes, shared knowledge, and likely had some awkward conversations by the fire. Over time, pure Neanderthal populations faded out. The last known Neanderthals likely lived in southern Iberia, in places like Gibraltar, where they managed to hold on for a few thousand more years, like the final flicker of a candle. Then the archaeological trail goes quiet. No new tools, no fresh burials, just silence. But this wasn't failure. It was a closing chapter, one that left a lasting imprint. Neanderthals didn't vanish in vain. Their legacy remains, not in towering monuments or ancient scrolls, but in our genes, our bones, and our blood. They weren't erased, they were integrated. For much of history, Neanderthals have been misrepresented, not because of their biology, but due to public perception. They've long been victims of poor publicity. When the first Neanderthal fossils were found in the mid-19th century, scientists weren't sure what they were looking at. The skull had human-like traits but massive brow ridges, and the bones were unusually thick, like someone had turned a regular human into a heavy-lifting caricature. Victorian-era researchers, being who they were, quickly branded them as crude, primitive, and probably unpleasant dinner guests. Thus, the myth of the lumbering, grunting cave dweller was born, part monster, part awkward relative. The name Neanderthal didn't do them any favours. It sounded like something that might live under a bridge and throw rocks at goats. Early reconstructions didn't help either. One infamous depiction showed a Neanderthal hunched like a gorilla, blank-eyed and neckless. A caricature based, it turns out, on an elderly man with arthritis. Judging an entire species by one grandpa with a back spasm, that image stuck. Cartoons, movies and textbooks cemented the stereotype, a dumb brute dragging a club with poor posture. Meanwhile, the truth was far more complex. Neanderthals buried their dead, created symbolic art, crafted tools, and possibly even wore jewelry. But that nuance got buried beneath the myth. Why? Because it made us feel superior. Humans love a narrative where we are the chosen ones, the smartest ones, the final draft. Casting Neanderthals as failed prototypes helped us preserve that illusion and ignore the inconvenient truth of our shared DNA. Only recently, with mounting archaeological evidence, has this myth begun to crack. We're finally confronting the reality. Neanderthals were not mistakes. They were a parallel success, different path, same struggle. And now, shift your gaze to war-torn medieval Japan. A battlefield was no place for a woman, unless her name was Tomo Gozen. Imagine a dust-choked field of armoured men clashing steel, and amidst them, a lone figure not just holding her ground, but dominating it. She wasn't some noble woman playing warrior. She was a warrior, raised in the province of Echigo, trained to ride, shoot a bow from horseback, and wield a katana with terrifying grace. Men twice her size found themselves bleeding in the dirt. Her loyalty lay with Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a prominent general. But Tomo wasn't merely his retainer or ornament, she was his commander, his equal, his executioner. Contemporary records describe her as beautiful, white skin, long hair, delicate features, but those compliments didn't stop at appearance. They praised her unmatched archery, her swordsmanship, her absolute precision in battle. This wasn't courtly exaggeration, it was battlefield reality. She could break enemy lines, decapitate a foe mid-gallop, and ride on like nothing happened. Tomo Gozen was a storm wrapped in armor. Her rise wasn't random. It was forged in the chaos of the Genpei War, a brutal civil conflict between the Minamoto and Taira clans. Samurai codes were still being written. In that vacuum, she carved out space where no woman had dared. She didn't just fight, she led. She won duels. She brought back heads as proof of victory. She shattered every expectation of womanhood in 12th century Japan. Tomo Gozen wasn't an anomaly, she was a revelation. Before she ever stepped onto a battlefield, she had to survive a world that tried to keep her out. Born into a samurai class that expected daughters to be quiet and obedient, she was anything but. Her origins are murky. Perhaps she was raised in Yoshinaka's household as a concubine, foster sister, or trusted companion, but her skills, undeniable. While boys were handed swords and taught the way of Bushido, Tomo had to prove again and again that she could match them, even surpass them. Her training was relentless. She mastered kenjutsu for swordplay, kyudo for archery, all while learning to manage armor and ride a warhorse at full gallop. She likely trained in naginata, a curved blade polearm often wielded by female fighters, not as a ritual, but for real combat. This wasn't pageantry, it was survival. Before she was a legend, she was an outsider. Most women didn't carry weapons. They weren't invited to war councils, and they weren't expected to survive the battlefield. But Tomoe didn't adapt to the world. She forced it to adapt to her. Every technique she mastered had to be sharper, cleaner, and more devastating than those of her male peers, because if she failed, they wouldn't say a soldier made a mistake. They'd say a woman proved she didn't belong. Before Tomo Gozen could carve her name into the annals of history, she had to first carve her presence into the warrior world, cut by cut, day by day. Silence and obscurity weren't granted to her. They were claimed through pure determination. By the time Tomo Gozen entered adulthood, Japan teetered on the edge of ruin. In 1180, the Genpei War erupted, a ruthless civil war between the Taira and Minamoto clans. It wasn't merely a conflict of soldiers, it was a full-scale upheaval of Japan's political order. Emperors were manipulated like game pieces, and the samurai class stood ready to rewrite history. In the middle of it all stood Tomo. Her leader and perhaps her lover, Minamoto no Yoshinaka, was a distant relative of the more widely known Minamoto no Yoritomo. But unlike Yoritomo, Yoshinaka refused to remain behind the curtain. He sought authority over Kyoto, over the Minamoto lineage, over the nation itself. And when the war broke out, he wasted no time. From Japan's northern provinces, he raised his own army and marched south. Tomo was right there beside him. She wasn't a decoration for court appearances. Tomo led battalions. She made tactical decisions. When blood was spilled, she was in the front lines, sword in hand, giving commands few would dare challenge. She represented Yoshinaka's boldness. his disregard for convention, and his drive to win by any means. The Genpei War was brutal. Skirmishes took place across rivers, through forests, over mountains. Arrows fell like monsoon rains, and melee combat left fields soaked with blood. Tomo's most renowned triumph came during the Battle of Yokotagawara, where she led a charge that overwhelmed enemy lines. Records say she personally beheaded several foes and brought back their heads as evidence. Not for pride, but for proof. Each kill validated her presence. Each trophy told a story. But war wasn't only about triumph. It was about allegiance and betrayal. As Yoshinaka's influence expanded, so did his conflict with Yoritomo, who viewed his cousin as a rival. The Minamoto clan, already fractured by ambition, turned against itself. Though the Taira remained the formal enemy, Yoshinaka now had to protect himself from his own bloodline. Tomo remained by his side unwavering, but even unmatched combat skill couldn't cut through political scheming. As the war dragged forward, pressure increased, both on Yoshinaka's bid for dominance and on Tomo's fragile claim to legacy. In 1183, after a string of brilliant victories, Yoshinaka accomplished what many had thought unattainable. He expelled the Taira from Kyoto and seized control of the imperial court. At that moment he was the most powerful man in the country, and Tomo, victorious and blood-soaked, was still with him. But power is a blade with two edges. Yoshinaka had hoped to restore imperial rule, but the emperor and Kyoto aristocrats quickly saw him as uncontrollable. He looted the city, offended the capital's elite, and took steps that worried even his own allies. Worst of all, he attempted to dominate Emperor Go-Shirakawa, a bold act that sealed his political ruin. Yoritomo, now acting as the head of the Minamoto, reacted quickly. He labeled Yoshinaka a traitor and sent two loyal commanders, Minamoto no Noriyori and the legendary Minamoto no Yoshitsune, to eliminate him. Now the Minamoto were at war with themselves, and Tomo Gofen found herself fighting not the Taira, but her own clan. What followed was a rapid fall. Yoshinaka, once the daring insurgent, was now cornered and outmaneuvered. With only a small group of devoted followers, Tomo among them, he withdrew from Kyoto. Their final stand occurred at the Battle of Iwazu in early 1184. It was not a stand for victory, but for dignity. As enemy forces closed in, Tomo fought with unmatched ferocity. Chronicles claim she rode straight into enemy lines, sought out their strongest warrior, and decapitated him before galloping back through the chaos. This wasn't just prowess, it was defiance. She would not vanish quietly, but Yoshinaka understood the end had come. Legend says he told Tomo to leave the field, not because he questioned her valor, but because perishing beside a woman would dishonor a samurai commander. The irony was cruel. The fiercest warrior at his side was dismissed to protect his image. Did she obey? Some say she did. Others say she vanished into battle and was never seen again. Regardless, Yoshinaka's downfall marked the end of an age and the birth of a legend. Snow fell over Iwazu that February in 1184. The land was eerily still, hiding the violence about to erupt. Minamoto no Yoshinaka stood with only a few remaining men. Once the ruler of Kyoto, he was now hunted by his kin. His last fight had arrived. Tomo Gozen, steadfast as ever, refused to abandon him. The odds were hopeless. Hundreds of enemies, led by Yoshitsune and Noriyori, rushed toward them. Their armor shimmered. Their horses tore into frozen earth. As the cold wind roared, Tomo adjusted her helmet, drew her blade, and rode into immortality. According to the 14th century Heike Monogatari, she didn't retreat. She charged ahead like a storm, seeking the fiercest warrior she could find, Hatakeyama Shigetada, a renowned combatant in his own right, whether driven by rage, desperation, or simply an unwillingness to die silently. Tomo didn't wait for formality. She clashed swords, threw her opponent from his horse, and severed his head in a single swift movement. One final prize. This wasn't theatrical flair, it was the embodiment of the samurai code. Fighting to the death, dying with honor, proving one's worth in the face of certain defeat. For Tomo, that single moment would define her for generations to come. It echoed through history, retold and reshaped endlessly, becoming her eternal cry. At the same time, Yoshinaka's horse became stuck in a wet rice field, and a storm of arrows struck him down. His faithful ally Imai Kunihara ended his own life dramatically, placing a sword in his mouth and leaping off his horse. The warlord's innermost circle was wiped out. As for Tomo, here the historical accounts begin to diverge. One version says Yoshinaka instructed her to escape before his death, not wanting the dishonor of dying beside a woman. Another says she disobeyed, fought her way through the enemy, and disappeared into the mountains. Still another claims she was captured, married an enemy commander, and later became a Buddhist nun. None of these accounts have been verified. But one thing remains constant. Her last known action was not surrender, it was resistance. Tomo Gozen didn't merely fade away. She entered legend, remembered for one last blazing, unstoppable charge. After the blood-drenched snow of Awazu, Tomo Gozen vanished from official history, as if she had ridden off the battlefield into myth. No historian can confirm what became of her, and maybe that's appropriate. Warriors like Tomo were not expected to outlive the war. They were meant to die beside their master, blade in hand, honor intact. But Tomo may have chosen something even more daring, to live. The Heike Monogatari, our principal account of Tomo's life, presents conflicting endings. One version says she was taken prisoner and married one of Yoritomo's generals, Wada Yoshimori. She bore him a son, and after his death, she became a nun, stepping away from warfare and politics. Another version states she cut off her long hair, took on a new name, and disappeared into the mountain monasteries of Nagano. A third suggests she wandered as a ronin, a masterless warrior for hire, fighting on the edges of law and civilization. And then, nothing. Silence. Centuries passed with no confirmed details. The truth remains buried under layers of legend, manuscripts, and oral stories. Yet her disappearance became part of her mystique. By leaving history, she became eternal. She was no longer confined to a single fate, a specific title, or one idea of womanhood. Instead, she became a symbol of possibility. What makes her tale even more haunting is how Japan changed in the years that followed. The rise of the shogunate under Minamoto no Yoritomo signaled the start of the Kamakura era, a time of rigid patriarchy. Women were pushed further into the margins. Female warriors didn't disappear, but they were increasingly ignored, idealized or written out. Still, Tomo persisted. Not necessarily in textbooks, but in whispered tales passed between mothers and daughters, and among soldiers around fires. She haunted the samurai code, the woman who fought like many men, but submitted to no one. Over time, artists, playwrights, and poets brought her back, sometimes as a tragic lover, sometimes as a wrathful spirit, sometimes as the last true samurai, but always as someone who defied norms and left behind unanswered questions. Tomo Gozen didn't simply leave the world, she changed form, and the silence she left was louder than any death ever recorded. As the years passed, the woman once dreaded on the battlefield became something entirely different, a cultural icon shaped by monks, dramatists, and poets. In a time when women were expected to stay invisible, Tomo Gozen became unforgettable. The Heike Monogatari, a vast semi-historical epic written in the 13th century, was the first to immortalize her. But it was never just a historical record. It was meant for performance, for drama. Blind traveling monks, known as Biwa Hoshi, would move from place to place, reciting the Genpei War's tales to the sound of the Biwa lute. Through their voices, Tomo Gozen was revived, not only as a warrior but as a tragic heroine. Later renditions embellished her further. In No and Kabuki theatre, she became a recurring presence. Her beauty was exaggerated, her loyalty dramatized, and her battles turned into stylized spectacles. Audiences didn't just see her fight, they cried for her, admired her, and feared her. Yet this romantic lens had a cost. The real Tomo, the one who took heads and led cavalry, was softened. Her armor was replaced with elegant robes. Her swordsmanship became a metaphor for quiet endurance. She was made digestible, honorable, subdued. Even so, her image endured. During the Edo period, artists portrayed her galloping into combat, face composed, sword ready. Samurai manuals listed her among the greatest martial figures. Sword schools evoked her name. Even as her story became legend, it retained the sharpness of war. Today, in modern Japan, Tomo Gazan she is frequently spoken of alongside other historic warriors, Musashi, Benkei, Yoshitsune, but Tomoe carries a different burden, the defiance of gender norms. She wasn't merely an anomaly, she was a direct challenge to established expectations. Across generations, women have looked to her as living proof that their rightful place is wherever they choose, even if it's at the center of the fight. The more she drifted from documented reality, the more she came to represent something larger, a woman who shouldn't have existed, yet did. A fighter who couldn't be controlled, yet remained. A story that never found its end. Though her blade was put away more than 800 years ago, her legacy remains. Not just in legend, but deep in the cultural memory of Japan and far beyond. As time moved on, she became something more than a figure from the Genpei War. She became a symbol of independence, resistance, and the disruptive strength of a woman who refused to follow the expected path. During the Edo period, when samurai customs became rigid and codified, her image was used both to inspire and to warn. Some viewed her as the embodiment of perfect loyalty, a warrior who remained faithful until the final moment. Others, especially conservative thinkers, saw her as a threat, evidence that when women stepped outside their assigned roles, it brought disorder. Yet even those who feared her could not erase her. By the Meiji Restoration in the late 1800s, as Japan aimed to modernize and redefine itself, Tomo returned to the public eye, this time as a patriotic role model. She appeared in school books, children's plays, and nationalist art, often shown alongside famous male samurai. Though her image was cleaned up, one fact remained. A female warrior had been added to the canon. In the 20th and 21st centuries, her legacy shifted again. She became a favored subject for manga creators, video game designers, feminist thinkers, and film directors. In a media landscape filled with formulaic characters, Tomo stood out. A woman whose story wasn't centered on love, but on battle. She wasn't the abandoned lover. She was the one who took up arms and pressed forward. Modern depictions of Tomo reflect changing social views. Some portray her as a feminist trailblazer. Others frame her as a tragic figure whose destiny remained incomplete. Some cast her as a lingering warrior spirit, haunting ancient battlegrounds. Regardless of how she is presented, she remains powerful, layered, and elusive. Even in politics and education, her name has come to represent resistance. Schools bear her name. Martial arts academies cite her in their teachings. She appears on postage stamps, promotional art, and anime plots. Her name is often invoked whenever someone seeks to prove that the warrior spirit is not confined by gender. She may have fought in one war, but her memory rallies people in countless battles for identity, equity, and belonging. Tomo Gozan never asked to be remembered. She left behind no memoirs, no letters, no poetry. What she left behind was the one thing a warrior of her time truly valued, a legacy written in blood, loyalty, and flame. In doing so, she achieved something rare, immortality, without ever demanding it. Unlike many women of her age, she wasn't preserved because she conformed to social ideals. She was remembered precisely because she broke those expectations. Every time she raised her sword among men who doubted her worth, she rewrote the rules of her era. And though she disappeared from history's official records, her silence only made her presence louder. In a society where quietness often defined a woman's value, the silence Tomo left after the Battle of Owazu became its own declaration. The lack of concrete facts about her fate gave generations of writers, thinkers, and rebels the space to give her story renewed purpose. She became a symbol of what could be, the proof that you can challenge the system and still become legend. Her name survives not just in books or entertainment, but in the drive of every woman who refuses to be unseen. every athlete who exceeds her limits, every leader told she's too intense, every fighter who stands without waiting for permission. Tomo Gozen is more than a name from the past. She is a flag-bearer of defiance, cloaked in silence. Today, statues of her can be found in Nagano and other places in Japan. She's studied in classrooms by schoolgirls. Cosplayers bring her to life at conventions. Martial artists whisper her name when training with the Naginata. She even features in international video games and series, reminding audiences everywhere that the female warrior is not fantasy, it is history. Still, perhaps her greatest strength lies in the unknown. Was she a concubine turned commander, a foster daughter brought up in the way of war, a wandering Ronin who left everything behind? We may never know the complete truth, but perhaps that's the point. Tomo Gozen was never meant to fit into a single version. She was meant to be many things, never confined by official records or forgotten by time, always galloping forward, sword drawn, into the legend she created for herself. Tens of thousands of years ago, some of the earliest evidence of water travel dates back over 40,000 years, far earlier than the dawn of farming. Even then, humans were crafting rafts to reach far-off lands like Australia, a feat requiring open ocean crossings of hundreds of miles. These weren't random drifts, they were intentional voyages, guided by a clear grasp of winds, tides, and the movements of the stars. By around 3000 BCE, shipbuilding had advanced dramatically. Civilizations in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and along the Nile were already using boats for fishing and trade. But the leap to true deep-sea navigation came when some cultures dared to sail far beyond the coastline. These early explorers faced staggering obstacles. No charts, no written manuals, and no certainty they'd ever return. Yet they set sail anyway, driven by need, wonder, and the instinct to survive. They interpreted the sea's signs like a language, watching the shape of waves, tracking cloud patterns over land, and following the flight of seabirds. The stars became their most trusted compass. In the north, Polaris held steady in the sky. In the southern hemisphere, they relied on the Southern Cross. They could sense the pull of unseen currents, read the direction of the wind by its sound, and most remarkably, pass this expertise down not in books but by word of mouth, through myths and rituals. Their instruments weren't metal tools or magnetic needles. They used memory, attention, and intuition. This wasn't just survival, it was a form of knowledge, scientific in its accuracy, cultural in its transmission, long before science had a formal name. As they crossed unknown waters, these ancient sailors did more than explore. They laid the groundwork for trade networks, migrations, and the earliest global exchanges between civilizations unaware of each other's existence. Long before Athens rose or Rome conquered, the island of Crete was home to one of the most advanced maritime cultures of the ancient world, the Minoans. From about 2000 to 1450 BCE, the Minoans weren't just island dwellers, they were seafaring engineers who transformed the ocean into a superhighway of commerce, culture, and influence. Their center of power was Knossos, a vast palace complex adorned with murals of dolphins, ships, and sea life. These weren't just decorative images, they were statements of identity. The Minoans lived in close connection with the sea. Their economy revolved around maritime trade, and their reach extended across the Aegean to Egypt, the Levant, and further. Unlike later Greek fleets designed for battle, Minoan ships emphasized balance and speed, ideal for diplomacy and commerce. Their vessels, often decorated with animal emblems like birds or bulls, used square sails and rows of oarsmen to move swiftly across the Mediterranean's unpredictable waters. These ships transported goods like wine, olive oil, ceramics, and bronze. But more than cargo, they carried cultural exchange. Through trade, the Minoans spread ideas, art styles, spiritual practices, and technology throughout the region. As for how they navigated, no physical Minoan maps have survived, yet scholars believe they used stars, visible landmarks, coastal silhouettes, water coloration, and bird behavior to guide their way. Their consistent returns from long voyages point to a sophisticated understanding of seasonal winds and maritime rhythms, well before such patterns were recorded in writing. One of the Minoans' most significant contributions to history was their role in the evolution of the Greek alphabet. Through interaction with Near Eastern seafaring cultures like the Phoenicians, the Minoans helped lay the foundation for one of the world's most influential writing systems. Their ships weren't just moving goods, they were vessels of cultural transmission. But like many sea-based powers, the sea itself may have brought their downfall. Around 1450 BCE, a cataclysmic volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, likely triggered massive tsunamis and volcanic ash fallout, crippling Minoan harbours and destabilising their influence. Whether their decline was caused by natural disaster or foreign invasion, Minoan ships eventually disappeared from the seas. Still, they left behind more than ruins. They left a blueprint for how to rule not with armies on land, but through mastery of the sea. If the Minoans were the ocean's artists, the Phoenicians were its relentless traders. From roughly 1500 BCE to 300 BCE, the Phoenicians, a loosely connected group of city-states such as Tyre, Sidon and Byblos, dominated the eastern Mediterranean not through warfare but through naval power. Their legacy isn't marked by vast empires or military campaigns. Instead, it's defined by their skill in navigation, trade, and spreading culture throughout the ancient world. The Phoenicians didn't build a centralized empire or capital. Their power rested in their fleets, numerous, fast, and expertly constructed. These ships, equipped with both square sails and rows of oars, could travel along coasts or sail across open waters with ease. With them, they transported cedarwood, glass, purple dye, and most crucially, ideas. They acted as intermediaries in the ancient economy, connecting regions like Egypt and Anatolia, Greece and Mesopotamia, North Africa and the Western Mediterranean. They founded settlements and trade outposts across many coastlines, the most famous being Carthage in North Africa, later a formidable rival of Rome. Each colony functioned as a hub in an expansive maritime network, funneling wealth and knowledge back to the eastern Phoenician cities. How did they traverse such long distances without a compass or sextant? Much like the Minoans, the Phoenicians relied on the stars, especially Polaris in the northern hemisphere. They also had detailed knowledge of wind systems, shoreline landmarks, and ocean currents. Many researchers credit them with They are often credited with creating one of the earliest celestial navigation systems known in the Western world. Still, their most enduring legacy wasn't a traded item, it was an invention, the alphabet. Developed around 1050 BCE, the Phoenician writing system marked a major leap forward. It consisted of only 22 symbols, each representing distinct sounds rather than entire words or syllables. This phonetic approach laid the groundwork for later scripts, influencing Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic alphabets. With this linguistic innovation and their unmatched maritime resilience, the Phoenicians did more than trade, they built bridges. They transformed the ocean from a divider into a connector, linking different cultures, tongues, and economies. And they didn't do it by conquering mines and territories. They did it by navigating from one shore to another. For them, the Mediterranean wasn't just a route, it was an identity. While the Mediterranean bustled with Phoenician merchants and Greek triremes, a completely separate story was unfolding on the far side of the planet, one told through outrigger canoes, twin-hulled boats, and stars etched into the skies above the vastest ocean on Earth. These were the Austronesian navigators, explorers who didn't merely sail seas but populated nearly half the Earth's surface, all without using metal tools, maps or writing systems. Emerging from the region now known as Taiwan around 3000 BCE, the Austronesians expanded south and east at an extraordinary pace. By 1500 BCE they had arrived in the Philippines, Indonesia, and the edges of New Guinea. By 1000 BCE they had pushed into Micronesia and Melanesia, and by the first few centuries CE their reach extended from Madagascar in the west to to Easter Island in the east, forming a sweeping path of migration over 10,000 miles wide. Their watercraft were feats of craftsmanship. Austronesian builders created outrigger canoes for better balance, and later introduced large, double-hulled vessels that could transport entire families, animals, and supplies across open seas. They utilized wind with crab-claw sails and maneuvered near islands with precise paddling. But what made them truly remarkable was their unrivaled navigational prowess. They employed the sun, moon, planets, and over 200 individual stars to steer their journeys. But their knowledge didn't end there. Polynesian wayfinders, among the most renowned of these seafarers, interpreted the sea like a map in motion. They recognized small shifts in swell direction created by distant islands, monitored bird patterns, watched cloud types, and even tasted seawater for changes in salinity that indicated land nearby. This wasn't guesswork, it was a detailed, practiced science, passed down through oral traditions, chants, and memorization tools. Their expansion wasn't aimless, it was strategic and replicable. Lapita pottery, a unique cultural marker, traces their movement across the Pacific and illustrates how their network of communities remained connected. They weren't simply travelers, they were nation builders, spreading crops, languages, and innovations wherever they landed, and in many respects, they continue to do so today. Modern studies in genetics, linguistics, and archaeology keep revealing just how vast and advanced Austronesian navigation really was. These sailors didn't merely reach distant lands, they tied together some of the world's most isolated places, long before European voyages ever began. To them, the Pacific wasn't a void, it was a path. When most people picture ancient Egypt, they imagine massive pyramids and tombs beneath the desert, rarely ships. Yet Egyptians were deeply familiar with water. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was their essential transportation route, their guide, and their introduction to seafaring. What's less known is that Egyptian maritime exploration went far beyond the riverbanks and extended into the Red Sea, and possibly even farther. Their control of the Nile began early. By around 3000 BCE, Egyptians were already constructing large wooden boats with planks tied together using rope and sealed with resin. These boats, powered by sails and oars, were used to move troops, food, and supplies across the vast stretch of the Nile. But their reach didn't stop there. By the reign of Pharaoh Hatshepsut in the 15th century BCE, Egypt was launching overseas expeditions from Red Sea ports. Her famed journey to the land of Punt, possibly located in present-day Somalia, Eritrea, or southern Arabia, was a major milestone in maritime history. Depictions carved at her mortuary temple in Deir el-Bahari show large transport ships returning with exotic goods, gold, incense trees, animals, and more. These were not random voyages. They were carefully organized, planned with awareness of monsoon winds, ocean currents, and seasonal shifts. Egyptian crews likely sailed close to land, used celestial cues to stay on course, and may have enlisted experienced local mariners from the Red Sea region. Some researchers even theorize indirect Egyptian trade with the Indus Valley, especially during peak periods of exchange with Mesopotamia. Though direct proof is limited, finds like ivory, spices, and lapis lazuli hint at Egypt's involvement in a larger Indian Ocean trade web. The vessels they used were also ahead of their time, constructed from imported Lebanese cedar, with curved hulls and square sails, capable of handling the rough waters of the Red Sea. Although Egypt never became a dominant sea power like the Phoenicians, their approach to seafaring carried lasting importance. They were among the earliest to see maritime travel as more than practical. It was royal, religious, and strategic. Where they built pyramids on land, at sea, in the dusty landscapes of what is now Pakistan and northwest India, one of the world's most ancient urban societies once flourished, the Harappans, also known as the Indus Valley Civilization. Between 2600 and 1900 BCE, they constructed advanced cities known for their complex drainage systems, uniform bricks, and impressive urban design. But beneath these architectural marvels lies a lesser-known but critical truth. The Harappans were skilled maritime traders. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Harappans left behind no deciphered script, no grand carvings of fleets, and no legendary tales of sea expeditions. Yet traces of their seafaring expertise are quietly preserved in archaeological finds. At Lothal, a major Harappan port in modern-day Gujarat, excavations uncovered what is believed to be one of the earliest dockyards known to history. Measuring 218 meters in length and equipped with floodgates and channels, the dockyard once connected to a river system leading to the Arabian Sea, clear evidence that Harappan engineers looked not only inland, but outward toward the oceans. Artifacts fill in the rest. Harappan seals, ivory, beads, and ceramics have been discovered in Mesopotamian sites, notably in the Sumerian city of Lagash. Akkadian records refer to a distant land called Meluha, likely a reference to the Indus region, from where ships arrived with rare goods. In return, the Harappans imported materials like silver, tin, and lapis lazuli, pointing to a vast trade network that spanned from the Persian Gulf into the broader Near East. As for their vessels, while no complete Harappan ships survive, terracotta boat models and carved images indicate they used flat-bottomed riverboats and ocean-worthy crafts. They likely utilized the same seasonal monsoon winds that later propelled Arabian and Indian sailors across the Indian Ocean. Harappan sailors probably hugged coastlines, stopped at natural harbors and river mouths, and navigated using patterns of currents and the night sky. In contrast to the militarized empires of their time, the Harappans were remarkably non-violent. Their cities lack major fortifications or signs of conflict. This makes their maritime trade even more notable. They didn't conquer foreign lands, they linked them through peaceful exchange and diplomacy. But around 1900 BCE, their civilization began to unravel. Rivers shifted course, trade networks weakened, and once bustling cities were abandoned. Their script disappeared with them, leaving a silent enigma. How far did their ships truly travel? Their voices may have faded, but the water routes they followed still whisper from harbours, carved seals and weathered stones. To the ancient Greeks, the sea was more than a route. It was fate. Surrounded by the Aegean, Ionian and Mediterranean seas, Greek civilization rose in a world where seafaring was as crucial as agriculture. From the age of Homeric myths to Athens' naval supremacy, the Greeks transformed maritime life into an art, a science, and a strategy. Their earliest legends, Odysseus braving monsters and Jason chasing a golden prize, were not just fictional tales but reflections of a society deeply intertwined with the ocean. Greek city-states like Athens, Corinth, and Rhodes depended on the sea, not just economically, but culturally. Their deities ruled over waves, their heroes journeyed by ship, and their influence floated on wooden hulls powered by vision and ambition. By the 8th century BCE, Greek settlers were expanding across the Mediterranean, founding cities from Sicily to the Black Sea's edge. These colonies weren't military outposts, they were centers of commerce, culture, and navigation, integral parts of an interconnected trading world. Trade flowed both directions: olive oil, wine, and pottery from Greece, grain, metals, and enslaved people from abroad. To travel, Greek mariners used coastal landmarks, celestial bodies, particularly the rising and setting of stars, and oral knowledge passed down through generations. Their ship designs evolved from simple cargo boats to formidable naval vessels like the trireme, a sleek galley with 3 tiers of oarsmen, rowed by up to 170 individuals, and armed with a bronze ram at its prow. The trireme became more than a ship. It symbolized the ideals and authority of Athens itself. During the 5th century BCE, Athens held the strongest naval force in the ancient world. The Delian League, initially formed to resist Persian invasions, turned into an Athenian-led sea empire. Their navy controlled shipping lanes, collected tribute from allied states, and funneled wealth into Athens, fueling its golden age of culture and thought. But with dominance came risk. In the Peloponnesian War with Sparta, Athens' dependence on naval strength became a weakness. Defeats at sea, sieges, and internal unrest led to the city's downfall. Still, the impact remained. Greek achievements in cartography, astronomy-based navigation, and ship design shaped Roman and later European naval traditions. Their view of the ocean as a place for heroism, discovery, and drama still echoes in Western culture, though the Romans began as farmers and herders far from the coast. Once they turned to the sea, they didn't simply join the naval ranks of the ancient world, they conquered them. What had been a patchwork of competing fleets and scattered ports became what Rome proudly called Mare Nostrum, our sea. In its early days, Rome wasn't a maritime giant. Coastal waters were controlled by Etruscans and Greeks, while the western Mediterranean was dominated by Carthage, whose navy, founded by Phoenician settlers, was the most formidable of its time. But everything shifted during the Punic Wars. Faced with Carthage's dominance at sea, the Romans made a daring decision. They dismantled a captured Carthaginian warship and used it as a model. In an extraordinary act of industrial resolve, they constructed an entire navy, hundreds of ships in a matter of months. But they introduced something uniquely Roman, the corvus, a boarding ramp that transformed naval combat into infantry warfare. This innovation leveraged Rome's greatest advantage, its foot soldiers, allowing them to storm enemy decks as if they were storming a fortress. Defeating Carthage in the Punic Wars gave Rome far more than sea supremacy. It delivered control over Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, and eventually the entire Mediterranean rim. Roman vessels, both military and commercial, cruised the sea lanes, carrying food supplies, troops, and luxury imports from regions like Egypt, Gaul, and Syria. Bustling ports such as Ostia and Alexandria became major trade hubs, transforming the Mediterranean into a Roman-controlled waterway. The Pax Romana, a time of relative peace that lasted 200 years, was largely sustained by this maritime dominance. Where seas were once ruled by pirates and fractured powers, Rome imposed stability, creating a corridor for commerce. Grain shipments supported the empire's capital, while luxuries like silk, pearls, and spices flowed in from India and China via oceanic trade through the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. Roman mariners navigated using dead reckoning, coastal routes, and celestial cues, supported by written maritime guides known as periploi. Though they lacked magnetic compasses, they mastered wind patterns and currents, particularly the Etesian winds, which made return travel in the eastern Mediterranean reliable. Rome's conquest didn't stop at land, it was secured and sustained by sea. The Roman navy safeguarded trade routes, enforced imperial authority, and kept communication flowing across great distances. Through its fleet, Rome achieved what no prior power had, transforming the unpredictable sea into an ordered empire. Long before satellite maps, compasses, or engines, the ancient world was already tied together by an invisible network of maritime routes, etched not in ink, but in wind patterns, memory, and stars. From the papyrus boats of the Nile to the twin-hulled vessels of the Pacific, ancient seafarers didn't just explore the ocean, they shaped it. And their influence remains, visible in every harbour, every shipping lane, every vessel that crosses the water today. The knowledge passed down from the Minoans, Phoenicians, Austronesians, Egyptians, and others became the cornerstone of all future navigation. They learned to read the sky as if it were a chart, to sail with the Earth's natural rhythms, and to craft seaworthy vessels that could last for months, all without metal ships or written maps. Their discoveries weren't isolated, they built upon one another. Each maritime civilization absorbed lessons from others, contributing a new thread to the evolving fabric of global seafaring. The Phoenician alphabet enabled the record-keeping essential to complex trade. Austronesian navigation methods, preserved through oral tradition, inspired modern revivals of non-instrumental wayfinding. Greek study of stars and weather laid the basis for ancient cartography. Roman innovation in harbour construction and lighthouse design still influences modern port engineering. But beyond their tools, their true legacy was connection. Maritime routes allowed ideas to spread more swiftly than armies ever could. Religions, technologies, languages, crops, and even diseases crossed oceans. The ancient maritime societies didn't merely transport goods, they shaped civilizations. Without them, the Silk Roads would have ended at the coastline. Without them, empires may never have flourished. Isolated cultures might have remained strangers forever. And yet, despite their monumental impact, most early sailors remain unnamed. Their deeds were rarely written. Their vessels crumbled and vanished with time. What endures are fragments. A piece of pottery inside a sunken ship, a ruined dock buried beneath modern foundations, a star map carved on bone or bark. But their influence still rides the currents. Every cargo ship crossing the Suez Canal, every satellite-tracked freighter on the Pacific, every naval vessel in the Mediterranean owes a debt to those first voyagers who dared to chase the unknown. They may have lived in the distant past, but they were never primitive. They were the original navigators of humanity's shared journey. In the ancient world, to be born into royalty was to be both blessed and burdened. From the moment a child entered a palace, they became more than a person. They became a symbol, a political tool, and the future of a kingdom. Their education didn't begin in school. It began in the nursery, surrounded by whispers of bloodline, power, and danger. While ordinary children learnt survival through labour, the elite were trained for leadership from infancy. Every movement they made, every word they uttered was scrutinized, corrected, and shaped. Their lives were rehearsals for crowns they hadn't yet worn. They didn't learn to read for pleasure. They learned to decipher legal codes and diplomatic agreements. They didn't speak to express thoughts. They were taught to command, flatter diplomats, and deliver law with authority. What they studied depended on their homeland and dynasty, but the purpose was always the same: to cultivate dominance, presence, and continuity. A prince in Babylon would be trained in standardized rituals by scribes. An Egyptian successor would be introduced to hieroglyphs, temple rites, and divine myths. In Greece, philosophy reigned. In Persia, military discipline was the foundation. In China, Confucian teachings structured the curriculum. Even their playthings had political purpose. Miniature weapons, strategic board games, and symbolic animal figures reflected the roles these children were expected to embody. Tutors were more than instructors. They were guardians, handpicked by the royal court. They were trusted, elite, and easily replaceable. If the royal child failed in their duties, it was the tutor who faced the consequences. The pressure was immense. An unprepared heir wasn't just a family concern. It was a threat to national stability. A weak or ill-equipped child could easily become a pawn in the hands of rivals or rebellious relatives. Royal education then wasn't about personal growth. It was about protecting the dynasty. Yet despite its severity, this education could also be dazzling. These children were introduced to astronomy, medicine, foreign languages, ethics, and the arts long before such knowledge reached the general population. Some grew into polymaths, leaders, thinkers, and strategists, trained not just to govern but to surpass everyone in the room. Being born into royalty in the ancient world wasn't simply a stroke of fortune. It was the beginning of a lifelong trial, and education was the first contest. Behind many influential rulers of the ancient era stood a lesser-known figure, the tutor. They were far more than caretakers. They were intellectuals, priests, military leaders, and political agents. Their responsibility was to mold a child into not just an adult, but a ruler, a diplomat, and at times a semi-divine figure. Few student-teacher relationships are as well known as that of Aristotle and Alexander the Great. Chosen by Philip II of Macedon, Aristotle's role was to refine the impulsive prince beyond mere combat. He taught him moral philosophy, rhetoric, biology, geography, and metaphysics, instilling a deep thirst for wisdom. When Alexander eventually marched across the known world, he brought with him copies of Homer and philosophical works like sacred relics. Aristotle had done more than educate. He had constructed the intellectual framework of a world conqueror. But Aristotle was not alone in this tradition. In Rome, the Stoic philosopher Seneca served as tutor to the young Nero. He attempted to guide the boy with reason, virtue, and moderation. However, history shows Nero became one of Rome's most infamous emperors. Seneca's failure wasn't entirely his own, but it revealed how even the wisest tutors couldn't always override a student's darker nature or the toxic pull of court politics. In Persia, tutors were often drawn from the military, men trusted by the royal household to instill discipline and loyalty. Princes of the Achaemenid dynasty were taught to hunt, ride, and fight from a young age, alongside moral training in honesty and justice, all under constant supervision by elite instructors. Their education was rigorous, practical, and deeply tied to the political needs of empire. In ancient China, Confucian scholars held immense authority over the education of royal heirs. They taught the importance of family devotion, social hierarchy, and proper ritual. But a misstep, a single wrong idea, could cost them dearly. If a tutor's teaching contradicted the emperor's doctrine, the punishment could be exile or execution. Being a royal tutor meant shaping history from the shadows, an unseen force behind the throne. They had to be intelligent yet discreet, respected yet humble. It was a dangerous role, too influential, and they drew envy, ineffective, and they were replaced, successful, and they were remembered only if their pupil made history. While the children of farmers learned through daily life, the young elites of ancient kingdoms were educated behind palace walls, in private academies, temple schools, and at times in secret priestly institutions where knowledge was guarded like treasure. For royalty, education wasn't simply preparation for leadership, it was a tool for controlling access to power itself. In ancient Egypt, it was the priesthood that managed education. Royal offspring, especially future pharaohs, sometimes trained within temples where they learned hieroglyphics, sacred scriptures, religious ceremonies, astronomy, and healing practices. This knowledge was not shared with commoners. Literacy was rare, revered, and reserved for those destined to rule or to mediate between the divine and human realms. Much of this learning took place in what we might now call hidden schools, within temples such as Karnak or Heliopolis. Wisdom was passed secretly from priest to student. The curriculum wasn't just spiritual, it was a means of political control. To perform rituals, interpret omens, or recite incantations was to command power over life, death, and destiny. Persia had its own elite schooling system. The sons of noble families, particularly those close to the monarchy, were educated in what the historian Herodotus described as the royal school. Shielded from public view, these boys were taught honesty, equestrian skills, archery, and leadership. They also studied the ethics of Zoroastrianism and learned statecraft. This wasn't limited to royalty. It was training for future governors, generals, and administrators, men expected to run the empire's territories with absolute loyalty. In ancient India, royal children often studied in gurukulas, forest academies led by learned Brahmins. Though ordinary children had limited access, princes were placed under the guidance of a single guru, who taught everything from Vedic hymns to martial arts. The education was all-encompassing, intellectual, spiritual, and physical, and always structured by caste and social role. Even in Greece, where education was more broadly available in some city-states, elite boys in places like Sparta and Athens received specialized instruction. Spartan royal sons in Spera were enrolled in the agoge, the state-operated military school. Meanwhile, wealthy families in Athens hired personal tutors to teach logic, strategy, and persuasive speech, because winning battles was only part of leadership. Winning debates could be even more crucial. Across these civilizations, knowledge wasn't simply shared, it was protected, handed down like a blade, meant only for those deemed worthy to wield it. In the ancient world, royal women were rarely expected to command armies or govern kingdoms, but that didn't make their education unimportant. In many dynasties, the instruction given to elite daughters was as deliberate and strategic as that of their brothers. These young women weren't just daughters, they were future queens, high priestesses, diplomatic assets, and occasionally influential leaders in their own right. In Egypt, Royal women could hold extraordinary power. Figures like Hatshepsut and Nefertiti didn't merely stand beside pharaohs. They ruled, oversaw temple construction, and conducted diplomacy. Such influence required education. Egyptian princesses often studied under temple priests, learning to read hieroglyphs, manage estates, recite sacred texts, and perform religious rites. Those destined to become gods' wives of Amun were trained in theological knowledge and ritual practices far beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. Some even took part in governance with a level of education that matched or exceeded that of men. In Persia, royal women lived behind palace walls, but they held significant responsibilities. Achaemenid queens managed vast lands, controlled treasuries, and maintained court alliances. To do this, they were taught record-keeping, diplomacy, and elite court protocol. Greek historians like Xenophon noted the political involvement of Persian queens, suggesting they were educated in governance, even if their power remained behind the scenes. In ancient Greece, the situation varied. In Athens, even aristocratic women received minimal education, focused mostly on domestic roles, music, weaving, household skills, and some literacy. But in Sparta, royal daughters were raised for strength. They trained physically, learned public speaking, and were immersed in Spartan ideology. A Spartan princess could manage estates, assert her opinion publicly, and uphold family legacy, especially in times of war, when many men died young. In India and China, elite women's education reflected religious values and dynastic ambition. During the Gupta Empire, royal daughters were sometimes trained in Sanskrit, music, poetry, and philosophy, skills intended to elevate their status and charm. In imperial China, empresses and royal consorts studied Confucian ideals, calligraphy, and strict palace etiquette. Those who stepped into political roles like Empress Lu Ji or Wu Zetian learned far more: governance, surveillance, and state administration, often under the guise of ritual refinement. Royal women were expected to enchant, not rule, but when fate demanded leadership, they often assumed power. In such moments, their education became more than ceremonial. It became their arsenal. If swords won wars, then speech conquered empires. In the ancient world, a ruler's ability to speak wasn't just a refined trait, it was a crucial weapon. Language, oratory, and public persuasion were tools of diplomacy, rule, and defense. That's why elite children weren't merely taught how to talk, they were trained to influence, persuade, and dominate through language. Nowhere was this more evident than in ancient Greece, where rhetoric was considered a defining trait of a cultured leader. Athenian aristocrats studied under famed instructors like Socrates and later the Sophists, who taught speech-making as both art and method. Young elites practiced declamation, debated in assemblies, and mastered the triad of persuasive technique, logos, logic, pathos, emotion, and ethos, credibility. For future rulers, a sharp mind and eloquent voice were often more valuable than any weapon. This ideal spread across borders. In Rome, noble boys were trained in oratory from childhood. They memorized speeches by Cicero, learned courtroom tactics, and rehearsed the delivery of arguments with grace and restraint. For imperial heirs, public speaking wasn't just ceremonial, it was survival. One careless phrase could bring scandal, one masterful address could move the Senate. Even in monarchies where kings held absolute authority, words still carried immense weight. In Egypt, the pharaoh was seen as a divine voice. His proclamations had both spiritual and legal force. Royal offspring were taught formal speech and ceremonial recitations used in rituals and processions. In Mesopotamia, scribal academies trained elite youth not only to write, but to persuade, crafting royal edicts, diplomatic missives, and epic hymns. In Persia and India, language held a different but equally powerful role. Persian princes learned several languages: Old Persian for court matters, Aramaic for diplomacy, and sometimes Greek or Median. They were trained to negotiate, flatter, and intimidate with perfect timing and tone. In India, under empires like the Maurya and Gupta, royal pupils studied Sanskrit texts and political treatises like the Arthasastra, which taught strategy, rhetoric, espionage, and statecraft. Even in cultures dominated by oral tradition, such as among Celtic and Germanic elites, speech was authority. A prince who could not speak well was considered unfit to lead because in the end, authority wasn't simply seized, it was declared into being. For ancient rulers, the sky wasn't just filled with stars. It served as a calendar, a directional tool, a timekeeper, and at times a divine message. Beneath that celestial canopy, numbers carried weight. Mathematics and astronomy weren't optional studies for royal successors. They were foundational skills, shaping a ruler's understanding of calendars, taxation, architecture, warfare, and even destiny. In Mesopotamia, long before Pythagoras became known, Babylonian elites were already using a base 60 numerical system, predicting eclipses and charting planetary paths with remarkable accuracy. Royal tutors, often priest astronomers or scribes, taught princes how to interpret cuneiform tablets filled with astronomical records, weather data, and prophetic signs. These weren't abstract numbers. They informed decisions about military campaigns, agricultural timing, and ceremonial observances. In Egypt, mathematics was woven into the very fabric of authority. Pharaohs needed to understand land measurement for post-flood taxation and to manage vast construction efforts, temples, tombs, pyramids that demanded geometric planning and logistical control. Astronomy played a central role in religious life, and royal students were taught to monitor the heliacal rising of Sirius, which signaled the Nile's flooding and marked the beginning of the new year. In ancient India, noble youth were introduced to the mathematical traditions found in texts like the Sulba Sutras, and later, Aryabhata's work on algebra and celestial motion. Astronomy blended science and spirituality, guiding ritual timing and omen interpretation. A wise ruler might consult astrologers, but an educated one could interpret the heavens independently. The Greeks refined these systems, approaching them through logic and structured inquiry. A Macedonian heir such as Alexander would study numbers and astronomy alongside ethics and dialectic. Greek royal instruction, influenced by thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, viewed mathematics as a pathway to understanding cosmic order, and thus a ruler's role within it. In China's imperial court, astronomy held great importance. Emperors were believed to mediate between heaven and earth, and their legitimacy was reinforced through accurate celestial predictions. Court astronomers held high status, and princes learned to chart lunar phases, forecast eclipses, and contribute to calendar corrections. Across all these civilizations, the learned ruler didn't merely rule over people, they commanded time, space, and fate itself. Their silent allies were numbers and stars. While books could legitimize a ruler's claim, it was the sword that protected their throne. For ancient royalty, education didn't stop at scrolls, it extended onto the battlefield, where bravery, physical skill, and strategic thinking were just as crucial as philosophy or governance. Elite sons, especially heirs, grew up with an unspoken principle: if you couldn't protect your crown, someone else would take it. In Sparta, this belief was institutionalized. Royal boys entered the agoge, a harsh state-run training school, at age 7. There, they were stripped of comfort and taught to endure pain, fight hand-to-hand, and master battlefield tactics. Even princes were not exempt. They bled, fought, and bonded with other Spartan youths, creating warrior leaders forged in shared adversity. In Persia, noble boys were schooled in the triad of aristocratic virtues: horseback riding, archery, and truthfulness. Riding was crucial not just for battle, but for royal hunts that doubled as military training. Archery represented discipline, accuracy, and martial strength. A prince who couldn't shoot an arrow was deemed unfit to reign. In India, the warrior caste, Kshatriyas, received instruction in Dhanuveda, the martial discipline. Royal children trained with swords, spears, maces, and bows. They also studied the philosophies of warfare through texts like the Mahabharata, which taught not only how to fight, but why, and what honor required when facing death. Egyptian and Mesopotamian heirs were likewise prepared to lead armies. They practiced driving chariots, throwing spears, and grappling in combat under the watch of seasoned officers. Though pharaohs were often shown striking down foes in dramatic images, those depictions stemmed from actual physical preparation. War wasn't symbolic. Rulers were expected to lead from the front. In Rome, upper-class boys were instructed in both virtus, manly valor, and disciplina, discipline. They sparred with wooden weapons, learned formation tactics, and studied military campaigns. Julius Caesar wasn't just a statesman, he was a battle-hardened commander, trained from an early age to wield both pen and blade. Even in bureaucratically inclined China, royal heirs practiced martial arts, archery, and horsemanship as part of their royal instruction. An ideal leader was expected to balance civil wisdom, wen, and military strength, wawu. In every great empire, martial education was not an option, it was a matter of survival. In royal courts, a misused word could spark war. A glance held too long might provoke scandal. In the ancient world, knowing how to sit, speak, and gesture was as vital as wielding a weapon. Etiquette was not frivolous, it was a strategic tool. Behind every diplomatic dinner or ceremonial bow was a silent contest of power, and royal education taught this with meticulous care. From China to Persia, courtly manners were codified with such precision that they bordered on paralysis. In Han China, royal sons were required to memorize and adhere to the Li, a detailed system of ritual codes that governed behavior in every aspect of life. From greeting a superior to performing proper mourning, a single lapse in protocol could be seen as an act of defiance. Young nobles were trained to move deliberately, speak with careful moderation, and read the subtle shifts of power in any setting. In Persia, royal children were instructed in the art of presenting themselves properly at court. This involved more than clothing and formal etiquette. It included how to receive foreign dignitaries, absorb insults with grace, and maintain composure under scrutiny. They were taught how to communicate indirectly, mastering the nuanced language and guarded speech needed to navigate a palace filled with informants and flatterers. In India, the Niti Shastra, the discipline of politics and moral strategy, formed a crucial part of royal education. Texts like the Arthashastra detailed how a ruler should handle betrayal, employ spies, and strike a delicate balance between diplomacy and violence. Heirs were expected to grasp these principles early, as a single misguided alliance or overly trusting gesture could cost them their crown or their life. The Greeks and Romans also placed great emphasis on refined court behavior. In Athens, aristocrats were instructed in charis, the cultivation of charm, grace, and personal presence. Roman boys were taught how to flatter, behave publicly, and observe others. Julius Caesar's upbringing wasn't limited to combat training. He learned how to sway senators, undercut rivals, and judge a man's ambition by the inflection in his voice. In Egypt, court etiquette merged with divinity. The pharaoh wasn't just a monarch, he was divine. Royal children were taught to maintain an aura of calm majesty at all times. Their physical presence was symbolic of cosmic balance. Even how they held their bodies carried significance. Their stillness wasn't seen as weakness, it was a form of command. Beneath all the formality and protocol, however, lay a world of surveillance. Tutors often trained royal children to test loyalties, collect information, and detect deceit. In every royal court, someone was always watching, and survival depended on watching in return. A royal education was never solely about developing the individual, it was about safeguarding the dynasty's future. For ancient elites, every lesson in philosophy, warfare, diplomacy, and decorum bore the weight of generations. A ruler who was properly trained could unify kingdoms, stabilize power, and be immortalized in legend and stone. A ruler poorly prepared could unravel everything their ancestors built. In many respects, royal education was the state's greatest gamble. Every gold coin minted, every manuscript copied, every tutor appointed was a wager on one child's ability to preserve the realm, and the burden placed upon that child, whether prince, princess, or political bargaining chip, was immense. Take Alexander the Great. His domination of half the known world wasn't simply due to ambition or military skill. It was built upon years of focused education from Aristotle, who instilled in him a passion for knowledge, philosophical debate, and a belief in his own divine purpose. Alexander didn't just conquer, he carried with him Greek ideals, science, and diplomacy, becoming a symbol of Hellenic unity. Compare this to Nero, who also received a rigorous education under the Stoic thinker Seneca. Despite having access to the finest instruction Rome could offer, he fell into tyranny, suspicion, and indulgence. His failure wasn't merely his own, it cast a long shadow over the Roman imperial system, sparking uprisings and weakening Rome's prestige for years. Education, it turned out, was no promise of success. It was a test of character. For royal women, the stakes were just as high. A queen consort might become a regent, a princess might be married off for political gain, or rise to sovereign power herself. The upbringing of leaders like Cleopatra or Wu Zetian wasn't indulgence, it was empire training. Their fluency in multiple languages, mastery of finance, and ability to survive treacherous court politics kept them alive and powerful. Even long after their deaths, the effects of their education continued to shape history. Many rulers became champions of learning, founding libraries and centers of study. Their own early instruction became a blueprint for future generations, repeated, expanded, and institutionalized. In the end, educating a royal child was never just about the individual, it was about preserving a legacy, ensuring the past endured and that the future would be ruled by intellect as well as force. Because in the ancient world, birth might grant a throne, but knowing how to keep it had to be taught.